The world outside the thick reinforced glass of the train car was a featureless smear of brown and ochre. I'd been watching the Mojave Desert slide by for the better part of 5 hours, a monotonous landscape of scorched earth and skeletal creosote bushes that did little to soothe a troubled mind. My mind, however, wasn't troubled. It was focused. It had to be. In the seat across from me, shackled to a steel loop bolted to the floor, sat Isaac. He hadn't spoken a word since we left the Barstow transfer station. He just stared out the window, his gaze as flat and empty as the desert itself. He wasn't a big man, maybe 5'10", with a lean, wiry build that hinted at a coiled strength. His hair was a dark, unruly mop, and his face was all sharp angles and shadows, dominated by eyes of a startlingly pale gray. He looked less like a dangerous criminal and more like a poet who'd had a string of very bad luck. But my dossier, a thick manila folder filled with heavily redacted reports and grainy photographs, told a different story. The official charge was multiple counts of aggravated homicide. The unofficial truth, the reason I was the one escorting him in a specially reinforced freight car instead of some standard-issue marshal, was locked in a secure compartment in my head. My name is Alton. I'm a United States Marshal, but the part of the service I work for doesn't get its name on letterhead. We're the people they call when things crawl out of the dark corners of the world that aren't supposed to exist. And Isaac, my quiet, poet-faced prisoner, was one of those things. The train, a long spine of freight cars pulled by 3 roaring diesel locomotives, was a silver thread cutting through the desolation. We were a high-priority transport, running a clear line straight through to a secure facility in Nevada. The rhythmic clack, 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 clack of the wheels on the rails was a hypnotic, lulling sound, but I fought against it, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos and keeping my senses sharp. Complacency gets you killed in my line of work. It was around 1,500 hours when the sky began to change. The endless pale blue started to bleed into a sickly yellow-brown at the horizon. It wasn't the gentle fade of a setting sun. This was something else. A wall of dust, rising from the desert floor like a biblical plague. I'd seen desert storms before, but this one looked wrong. It was moving too fast, its color too dense, too angry. "Looks like we're in for some weather," I said, mostly to myself. Isaac turned his head from the window, his pale eyes meeting mine for the first time in hours. A flicker of something I couldn't read passed through them. "That's not weather, Marshal," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing I hadn't expected. "It's a shroud." I grunted, dismissing his cryptic remark. "Poetry isn't going to help you where you're going." He gave a slight, humorless smile and turned back to the window. The wall of sand was closer now, a churning, roiling monster that was swallowing the horizon whole. The sun vanished. Daylight dimmed to a bruised twilight, and the wind began to howl, a high, mournful shriek that seemed to tear at the very air. The train car, a solid 20 tons of American steel, began to rock gently on the tracks. Within minutes, we were inside it. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a suffocating torrent of sand and wind. The noise was incredible, a deafening roar like a jet engine, punctuated by the sharp ping of rocks and debris striking the side of the car. The lights flickered overhead, then died, plunging us into a near-total darkness broken only by the faint red glow of a single emergency lamp near the door. The rocking grew more violent. I braced myself, my hand instinctively going to the heavy .44 Magnum holstered on my hip. I could hear the train's horn, a desperate bleating cry lost in the fury of the storm. The clack-clack of the wheels grew frantic, a panicked heartbeat, and then came a sound that no one ever wants to hear on a train. The high-pitched, agonized scream of metal twisting beyond its limits. My stomach lurched as the floor beneath me dropped away. There was a moment of weightlessness, a terrifying, suspended breath before impact. The car slammed into the ground with a force that threw me from my seat like a rag doll. My head connected with something hard. A wall, a support beam, I don't know. Stars exploded behind my eyes. The world became a symphony of destruction. The shriek of tearing steel, the shatter of glass, the deep, guttural groan of the earth itself protesting the violation. I was tossed through the darkness, a passenger in a steel tomb that was being ripped apart around me. The shackles holding Isaac snapped with a percussive crack, the sound barely audible over the chaos. I saw his silhouette thrown past me, a flailing shape in the red emergency light. Then came another impact, a final, bone-jarring cataclysm that rolled the car over onto its side. A cascade of loose cargo crates I hadn't even realized were there broke free and came crashing down. I tried to move, to shield myself, but it was too late. Something immensely heavy struck my side, driving the air from my lungs in a pained gasp. The roaring and screaming of metal faded, replaced by the muffled, incessant howl of the wind outside. Sand poured in through a newly formed crack in the wall, a gritty, unstoppable stream. And then there was only darkness. A sharp, coppery taste filled my mouth. That was the first thing I registered. The second was a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate from my ribs up into my skull. For a long moment, I just lay there in the dark, listening to my own ragged breathing and the relentless scream of the wind outside our mangled steel coffin. The red emergency light was gone, its dim glow snuffed out by the violence of the crash. It was a perfect, disorienting blackness. My training kicked in, a calm, cold voice that cut through the pain and confusion. Assess, orient. Act. I did a mental inventory. My head hurt like hell, but I didn't think I was concussed. My left side was on fire, probably a few cracked ribs, maybe more. I could wiggle my fingers and toes. Nothing seemed to be broken. I was alive. That was a start. Slowly, carefully, I pushed myself up. The floor was now the wall, a slanted surface of buckled steel. The air was thick with the dust of the storm and the acrid smell of fried electronics. I patted myself down, my fingers finding the reassuring shape of my .44 still secure in its holster. My flashlight, a heavy-duty mag light, was clipped to my belt. I fumbled with it, my fingers clumsy, until the switch clicked, and a bright, steady beam cut through the oppressive darkness. The light revealed a scene of total devastation. The freight car was a disaster zone, a jumble of twisted metal and shattered crates. The neat, orderly transport had become a tomb. My beam swept across the wreckage, searching. It caught on a shape slumped against the far wall. Isaac. He was conscious, his head leaning back against the steel, those pale eyes blinking slowly in the sudden brightness. The shackle on one wrist was still closed, but the chain attached to it was a mangled, broken link. The storm's fury had done what no lockpick could. I limped over to him, my light steady on his face, my hand resting on the butt of my gun. "You all right?" He looked at me, then down at the broken chain dangling from his wrist. "Better than I was an hour ago," he rasped. A trickle of blood ran from a cut on his forehead, stark against his pale skin. "Don't get any ideas," I warned, my voice a low growl. "The deal's not off just because the train is." He didn't reply, just watched me as I turned my attention to the rest of the car. There had to be others. The train crew, an engineer, a conductor, a couple of brakemen. My job was to transport the prisoner, but I was still a lawman. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice sounding small against the storm's roar. "Anyone else hear me?" "Marshal's office." A faint groan answered from behind a pile of splintered wooden crates. I scrambled over, my ribs protesting with every movement, and shone my light into the gap. A man in a dusty railroad uniform was wedged in the space, his leg bent at an angle that made me wince. It was the young brakeman, a kid no older than 25. "My leg," he moaned, his face white with shock and pain. "I think it's broken." "Hang tight, son," I told him, forcing a confidence I didn't feel. "We'll get you out." It took the better part of 20 minutes. With Isaac watching silently, I managed to shift the debris enough to pull the kid free. He screamed when his leg moved, a raw, piercing sound. I found another survivor a few minutes later, an older, balding man I recognized as the engineer, Barnes. He was dazed and had a nasty gash on his arm, but was otherwise functional. The conductor and the other brakemen were gone. My light found them in the forward part of the car, their bodies still and broken amidst the wreckage. There was nothing I could do for them. The storm showed no signs of letting up. It was a physical presence, battering the outside of our metal shell, trying to get in. Sand was pouring through a dozen new seams, starting to build up in drifts on the floor. "We can't stay here," Barnes said, his voice trembling. "This whole thing could collapse. Or we'll get buried." He was right. Staying put was a death sentence. "The door's jammed," I said, after a futile attempt to wrench it open. "We need another way out." My flashlight beam found a large, jagged hole ripped in the ceiling, which was now a sidewall, where the car had scraped against something during the derailment. It was our only option. Getting the injured brakeman up there was going to be hell. "Isaac," I said, turning to him, "you're going to help me." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't," I said, letting the cold steel of my voice do the work, "I'll reshackle you to that beam right there and leave you here to get buried with the rest of this scrap. You help us get out, you get to stay mobile. Your choice." For a long moment, he just stared. Then he gave a slow nod. Together, he and I managed to hoist Barnes up through the hole. Getting the young brakeman out was a nightmare of gritted teeth and muffled screams. Finally, Isaac and I climbed out ourselves, emerging from the iron tomb into a maelstrom. The force of the wind was staggering. It felt like a solid wall, tearing at our clothes and forcing sand into our eyes, mouths, and lungs. Visibility was less than 3 feet. The air itself was a thick brown choke. The rest of the train was a ghostly, mangled shape nearby. Beyond that, there was nothing. No light, no shelter, just the howling chaos of the storm. We were exposed. We needed cover, and we needed it now. "This way!" Barnes yelled over the roar, pointing vaguely to our right. "There's a rock formation. A bluff, not far from the tracks." It was our only lead. Huddling together with me and Isaac half carrying the injured kid, we stumbled away from the wreck, leaning into the wind, blinded by the sand. It felt like we were walking on the surface of Mars. Every breath was a struggle. Then, through the swirling curtain of sand, a shape began to resolve itself. A dark, massive wall of rock rising from the desert floor. It was the bluff Barnes had talked about. As we drew closer, my flashlight beam traced its rugged face and found something that made me pause. A dark opening, an archway, unnaturally uniform, set deep into the rock. It looked like the entrance to an old mine or a railroad tunnel, our salvation. But as my light played over the entrance, I saw something else. On the rock face next to the opening, running from near the top all the way down to the ground, were a series of deep parallel gouges. They were thick as my arm and cut into the solid rock as if it were clay. They weren't tool marks. They were too ragged, too organic. They looked for all the world like claw marks. Giant, impossible claw marks. A cold knot formed in my gut. A primal warning that had nothing to do with the storm at our backs. The relief of escaping the sandstorm was immediate and overwhelming. The moment we stepped past the threshold of the tunnel, the deafening roar of the wind was cut off, replaced by a sudden, profound silence and the faint, dripping echo of water somewhere in the depths. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something old and vaguely metallic, like stale blood. I set the young brakeman, whose name I learned was Miller, down gently against the rock wall. He was pale, his forehead slick with a cold sweat, but he was tough. Barnes, the engineer, immediately started looking for something to use as a splint for the kid's leg. That left me and Isaac. I hadn't forgotten about him. As soon as we were inside, I produced a pair of high-tensile zip-tie cuffs from my belt pouch. "Hands behind your back. Now..." Isaac looked from my face to the cuffs, a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, in his pale eyes. "Really, Marshall? After all this?" "The train might be a wreck, but you're still my prisoner," I said, my voice flat and uncompromising. "Now turn around." He sighed, a sound of weary resignation, and complied. I cinched the thick plastic strip tight around his wrists, checking to make sure it was secure. It was a temporary measure, but it would have to do. I sat him down a good 20 feet away from Barnes and Miller, creating a clear line of sight between us all. In the enclosed space, the tension, which had been momentarily forgotten in the struggle for survival, came rushing back, thick and suffocating. The tunnel was old. The walls were rough-hewn stone, not modern concrete, and the floor was uneven dirt and gravel. There were no tracks, just the ghost of a rail bed, suggesting it had been abandoned for a very long time. My maglite beam cut a sharp white cone into the oppressive blackness, but it seemed to get swallowed up just 50 or 60 feet in, revealing nothing of the tunnel's true length. The darkness felt solid, ancient. Barnes managed to fashion a crude splint for Miller's leg using a piece of a shattered crate and strips torn from his own shirt. The kid bit down on a piece of leather from my belt to keep from screaming as Barnes set the limb as straight as he could. After it was done, an uneasy quiet settled over our small group. All we could hear was the distant, muffled howl of the storm outside, Miller's pained breathing, and the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from somewhere deeper inside the tunnel. We were safe from the sand, but I couldn't shake the image of those claw marks on the rock outside. They were wrong. Everything about them felt wrong. Then we heard the first sound. It was low, a deep, resonant scraping that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of our boots. It was the sound of rock grinding on rock, but with a strange, organic quality to it. Barnes and I froze, our heads snapping toward the impenetrable darkness down the tunnel. Miller let out a small, frightened whimper. "What was that?" Barnes whispered, his eyes wide in the beam of my flashlight. "Probably just the storm," I said, not believing it for a second. "Wind pushing through a vent somewhere." The sound came again, a little closer this time. A heavy dragging scrape followed by a low guttural rumble that wasn't wind. It sounded like something immense rolling over in its sleep. A primordial sound that tickled the lizard part of my brain, the part that knew the sound of a predator. I looked over at Isaac. He was sitting perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to a distant song. There was no fear on his face. Instead, he looked attentive, interested. That scared me more than the sound itself. I walked over to him, keeping my voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "You know what's making that noise, don't you?" Isaac raised his head, his pale eyes catching the light. "I know what it is," he corrected softly. "And so do you. Deep down. You felt it the moment you saw the marks on the rock." "I don't deal in feelings," I countered, my voice hard. "I deal in facts." "What is in this tunnel?" He leaned his head back against the wall, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "You government types. You put everything in a neat little box with a label. You have a file on me, don't you, Alton? Full of scientific jargon and clinical observations trying to explain the unexplainable." He gestured with his head toward the darkness. "Well, some things don't fit in your boxes. Some things are older than the rocks they sleep in. You think that storm out there was just a freak of nature? It was a welcome mat. It drove us off the rails and right to the front door. A cold dread, heavier and more real than anything I'd felt in the train crash, began to settle in my stomach. "The front door to what?" Isaac's smile vanished. His eyes bored into mine, and for the first time, I saw genuine, chilling seriousness in them. "You're a professional monster hunter, Marshall. You carry a big gun and you think you're the baddest thing in the valley. But you've spent your whole career chasing things like me. Things that are still part man." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You've just trespassed on the territory of something that has never been human. And it knows we're here." As if on cue, a new sound echoed from the blackness. It was not a scrape or a rumble this time. It was a wet, tearing sound, followed by a sharp, resonant crack. It sounded exactly like a large bone snapping in two. The snap of bone echoed in the tunnel, and then there was only the sound of our own panicked breathing. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. It was a heavy, listening silence, filled with the certainty that we were not alone. Miller, the young brakeman, was openly weeping now, quiet, terrified sobs he tried to stifle against his arm. Barnes was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, his eyes darting between me and the all-consuming darkness down the tunnel. I kept my flashlight beam pointed into that void, as if a simple ray of light could hold back whatever was in there. My knuckles were white where I gripped the mag light. The calm, professional training was still there, but it was fighting a losing battle against a primal, gut-level fear. Isaac was right. This was different. My work involved containing and sometimes terminating anomalies that bled the line between man and beast. This felt other, ancient. The one who broke was Barnes. The engineer, a man who probably spent 30 years dealing with logical problems, pressure gauges, timetables, engine mechanics, was utterly unprepared for this. "I'm not staying here," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I'm not going to just sit here and wait for that thing to come get us." "Nobody's going anywhere," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "We stick together. That's our only advantage." "Advantage?" he scoffed, a wild look in his eyes. "It's a 100-ton monster that eats rocks for breakfast. There has to be another way out. A ventilation shaft, another entrance. I'm not dying in here." Before I could stop him, he scrambled to his feet. He had a small, cheap flashlight he'd pulled from his pocket. and its weak yellowish beam trembled in his hand. "Barnes, don't," I ordered, stepping in his path. "That's a stupid way to die. Get back here." He just shook his head, his face set in a mask of stubborn terror. "It's better than no way at all." He pushed past me. I made a grab for his arm, but he shrugged me off and half ran, half stumbled into the darkness, his little light bouncing erratically. "Barnes!" I yelled after him. His light receded with terrifying speed, the small yellow circle shrinking until it was just a pinprick in the vast black. We watched it bob and weave for about 100 feet. He was calling out, his voice echoing strangely. "Hello? Is there a way out down here?" Then his light stopped moving. It just held steady, pointing at the far wall of the tunnel. "Barnes?" I called out, my voice tight. There was no answer. The pinprick of light remained perfectly still. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. And then, from the darkness where his light shone, we heard a new sound. It was a low, guttural exhalation, like a gust of wind from a massive bellows. The yellow light suddenly jerked, swinging wildly across the rock walls as if yanked by an unseen force. A single choked cry was ripped from Barnes's throat. Not a full scream, but a short, sharp bark of pure, unadulterated terror. The cry was cut short by a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was a wet, sickeningly heavy crunch, like a tree trunk snapping in a giant's fist, mingled with the sound of tearing meat. The yellow light winked out, and then there was silence again. A dead, final silence. Miller let out a choked gasp, burying his face in his hands. My own blood ran cold. The finality of it was absolute. One moment a man was there, the next, he was gone, erased. My training slammed back into place, a shield against the rising tide of panic. "Stay here," I ordered Miller, my voice a clipped, authoritative command. "Do not move from that spot." I didn't wait for an answer. I began to walk forward, my mag light held out in front of me, my .44 now in my other hand, the heavy weight of it a small, cold comfort. I moved slowly, deliberately, my boots crunching on the gravel floor. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I had to know. I had to see. I stopped where I estimated Barnes had been standing. I swept my light across the tunnel floor. It was empty, save for the dirt and rocks. Then I saw it. His small, cheap flashlight lay on the ground, its plastic casing cracked, the bulb shattered. A few feet away from it, the gravel was dark, wet, and disturbed. A wide, viscous smear of crimson led from that spot, dragging across the floor before disappearing into the impenetrable blackness just beyond the reach of my light. I raised the beam, tracing the path of the bloody trail up onto the tunnel wall. There, glistening in the harsh white light, was a single, partial handprint. It was slick with fresh blood, Barnes's blood. But it wasn't the blood that made my stomach clench into a knot of ice. It was the print itself. It was massive, 3 times the size of my own hand, with only 3 thick claw-tipped fingers. The evidence was irrefutable. The scent of fresh blood now hung heavy in the still, cold air. We were trapped in a cave with something huge, something powerful, and something that was very, very hungry. The minutes after I returned from confirming Barnes's fate were the longest of my life. I didn't have to say a word to Miller. The look on my face, the grim set of my jaw, told him everything he needed to know. The kid just sat there, huddled against the wall, his face ashen, staring into the darkness where the engineer had vanished. The sounds from the deep had stopped. The creature, whatever it was quiet now. Sated, perhaps. The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. I took up a position near the entrance, my back to the rock wall, my gun in my hand. I was watching the darkness in front of us, but my senses were also tuned to the man cuffed behind us. Isaac had been unnervingly silent through the whole ordeal. Not a word, not a sound. It was the change in the wind that I noticed first. The constant, high-pitched scream from outside the tunnel began to diminish, the fury lessening to a deep, mournful moan. The sand that had been blasting against the rock face with the force of a pressure washer eased, the sound fading to a gentle hiss. The storm was breaking. A moment later, a new light began to seep into the mouth of the tunnel. It wasn't the harsh yellow light of the desert sun, but a pale, ethereal silver. It pushed back the absolute blackness of the entrance, painting the first few feet of the cave in ghostly shades of gray and white. It was the full moon, finally breaking through the dissipating clouds of sand. A part of me felt a surge of hope. If the storm was over, maybe we could make a run for it. Try to get back to the tracks, flag down a search party. But then a low groan from behind me shattered that hope. I turned, my light and my gun snapping over to Isaac. He was no longer sitting calmly. He was on his knees, his head bowed, his cuffed hands braced against the ground. His whole body was trembling, a fine, violent tremor that shook his lean frame. "Isaac?" I said, my voice sharp. He didn't answer. His breathing was coming in ragged, painful gasps, like a man having an asthma attack. Sweat streamed down his face, carving clean paths through the grime and dust. He squeezed his eyes shut. His jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. "What's wrong with you?" Miller asked, his voice shaking. Isaac let out another groan, this one deeper, more guttural. He slowly, painfully, lifted his head and looked towards the tunnel entrance, towards the pale moonlight that was now spilling onto the floor just a dozen yards from where we sat. A look of pure, unadulterated agony was etched on his features. It was a look of a man fighting a war inside his own skin. "It's the moon," I said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying certainty. My dossier on him had been specific. The redactions had hidden the operational details, but the core facts were there. Incidents always occurred on a 3-day cycle, centered around the lunar apex. His muscles began to bunch and writhe under his thin shirt, twisting into unnatural shapes. He was fighting it, fighting the change with every ounce of his will, but it was a battle he was clearly losing. The moonlight, our supposed salvation, was a poison to him. "Marshall, what's happening to him?" Miller stammered, scrambling backwards, trying to put more distance between himself and the convulsing prisoner. The situation had gone from critical to catastrophic. We had a monster of unknown size and power hunting us from the darkness ahead, and my prisoner, our only other able-bodied man, was about to become a monster himself, right here in our tiny supposed sanctuary. I was trapped between two nightmares. I made a decision. There were no good options left, only less terrible ones. The thing in the tunnel had killed 2 men without breaking a sweat. It was the immediate, undeniable threat. Isaac. He was a wild card, but a wild card was better than a losing hand. I stood up, holstered my .44, and turned to face the terrified brakeman. I needed him focused. I needed him to understand the insanity I was about to propose. "Miller," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Listen to me. Forget what you think you know. Forget everything. I'm not just a U.S. Marshal, the unit I work for. We handle things that aren't supposed to be real." I knelt down in front of Isaac, who was now panting, his knuckles white where he gripped the dirt floor. I looked back at Miller, whose eyes were wide with confusion and terror. "My prisoner is not a normal man," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I had to lay the truth bare, no matter how insane it sounded. "He's the reason we're in a reinforced car in the middle of nowhere. The file calls him a lycanthropic class entity." I let that sink in for a second, then spelled it out in plain, simple English that no one could misunderstand. "His name is Isaac, and he's a werewolf." Miller stared at me as if I'd just started speaking in tongues. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The word hung in the air between us, absurd and terrifying. "Werewolf? You're crazy. That's not real." "Barnes is dead," I shot back, my voice cold and hard as iron. "Whatever tore him apart in that tunnel is real enough. Now, are you going to argue folklore with me? Or are you going to face the facts so we can get out of this alive?" My gaze shifted to Isaac. His struggle was getting worse. A low, guttural growl was now mixing with his pained gasps. His back arched and I heard a sickening pop, a sound like thick branches being snapped. He was losing control. The transformation was coming, whether he wanted it to or not. I had to act now. I stood and walked over to stand directly in front of my prisoner, blocking his view of the moonlight with my own body. I pulled a small, flat key from a hidden pocket in my jacket. "What are you doing?" Miller whispered, his voice trembling with horror as he realized my intention. "You can't be serious. You let him loose. He'll kill us both." "That thing in the tunnel will kill us both," I countered, never taking my eyes off Isaac. "It's big, it's territorial, and we are trespassing." With him, I nodded toward Isaac. "We have a chance. A slim one, but it's better than none. It's time to fight a monster with a monster." I knelt down. Isaac's head was bowed, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His whole body was racked with violent shudders. "Isaac," I said, my voice low but clear over his ragged breathing. "Listen to me. I know you can hear me. You know what's down that tunnel. I saw it in your eyes. It's an alpha predator, and this is its den." He let out a strangled cry as another spasm seized him. His fingers, which were braced against the dirt floor, were changing. His nails were thickening, elongating, turning a dark, horny gray. "I'm taking these cuffs off," I continued, holding the key steady. "I'm offering you a deal. A one-time only offer. You take care of our host down there. You kill it. You make sure the kid and I can walk out of here when the sun comes up. You do that, and I let you go. The hunt is off. I give you a 12-hour head start before I make my report. You get your freedom." He slowly, agonizingly lifted his head. His face was a contorted mask of pain. His canines were visibly lengthening, pressing against his lips. But his eyes, through the agony, his pale gray eyes were lucid. They were focused on me, weighing my words. "You save us," I finished, pressing the point, "and you save yourself. What do you say?" For a second that stretched into an eternity, he just stared, his chest heaving. Then, through a jaw that was already reshaping itself, he forced out a single, guttural word. "Deal." That was all I needed. I jammed the key into the lock on the zip tie cuff. The plastic was strained, tight against his swelling wrists, but the lock clicked open. I pulled the strip free just as another wave of change washed over him. The transformation began in earnest. It was not a magical, instantaneous event. It was a violent, biological nightmare. His scream was the first thing to go fully inhuman, losing its tenor and becoming a raw, bestial howl of agony that echoed through the tunnel. The sounds of his body changing were grotesque and unforgettable. I heard bones audibly snap, dislocate, and then re-knit with wet, sickening crunches as his skeleton reconfigured itself. He fell forward onto his hands and knees as his spine elongated, his shoulders broadening and hunching. Dark, coarse hair sprouted with unnatural speed, bursting through his shirt and skin, covering his body in a thick, black pelt. His face pushed forward into a muzzle, his ears migrating up and sharpening into points. His clothes, unable to contain the violent expansion of muscle and bone, ripped and shredded away. Miller was pressed against the far wall, his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. He was watching the impossible happen, a fundamental law of nature being brutally violated right in front of him. In less than a minute, the man I knew as Isaac was gone. In his place stood something else. It was not merely a wolf. It rose up on two powerful, digitigrade legs, standing nearly 7 feet tall. Its body was a terrifying tableau of corded muscle and black fur, ending in hands tipped with thick, vicious-looking black claws. It threw its newly formed wolfen head back, its jaws parting to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. The pale moonlight caught its eyes, which now glowed with a feral, yellow luminescence. The painful transformation was over. Now, there was only rage. The creature that was once Isaac stood at its full, terrifying height, its massive chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. The last vestiges of the man were gone, burned away by the lunar fire in its veins. It was a perfect engine of destruction, a bipedal nightmare of claw and fang. Tilting its grizzled muzzle towards the vaulted ceiling of the tunnel, it unleashed a howl. It was a sound that defied description. It was not the simple cry of a wolf. It was deeper, more complex, filled with the agony of its own creation, a furious declaration of its existence, and an unmistakable primal challenge. The howl ripped through the stillness of the tunnel, echoing and amplifying off the stone walls, until it felt like the mountain itself was screaming. It was a sound that said, "I am here. Come and face me." The echo of the howl died, plunging the tunnel back into a tense, listening silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the harsh, wet rasp of the werewolf's breathing and a horrified whimper from Miller. I stood my ground, my hand on my gun, my heart hammering against my ribs. The deal was made. Now I had to see if my monster was enough. Then, from the impenetrable darkness at the far end of the tunnel, came the answer. It began as a low, deep vibration that we felt more than heard, a tremor that ran through the rock floor and up into our bones. The vibration grew into a rumble, and the rumble swelled into a roar. It was a sound of pure, ancient malice, a noise dredged up from the deepest, darkest pits of the earth. It was the roar of a landslide, the bellow of an earthquake, a sound of geological violence and raw, hateful power. It completely dwarfed the werewolf's challenge, swallowing it whole. Whatever was coming, it was immense. A foul stench, the one I'd smelled faintly before, now rolled out of the darkness in a suffocating wave. It was the thick, coppery smell of old blood, the rot of a charnel pit, and the dry, dusty scent of the grave. It was the smell of death. The scraping sound began again, louder and closer than ever before. It was the sound of something impossibly heavy being dragged across the stone, punctuated by the sharp click of massive claws on rock. My light, still pointed down the tunnel, finally caught the first glimpse of it. two small, malevolent points of light glittered in the distance, eyes reflecting my beam back at me. They were set low to the ground and spaced wide apart. Then, the shape around them began to resolve itself as it lumbered into the faint moonlight spilling from the entrance. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was built like a gigantic hairless rhinoceros, its mottled gray hide looking as tough and cracked as ancient leather. Its body was a solid block of muscle, moving with a ponderous, unstoppable gait on four thick pillar-like legs that ended in broad, horny feet, tipped with blunt, rock-shattering claws. But it was the head that sent a spike of pure, primal fear through me. It was a nightmare vision, a grotesque fusion of reptile and mammal. It had no discernible nose, just two vertical slits that flared as it breathed. Its lipless mouth was a wide, straight gash that stretched nearly the width of its skull, filled with teeth that looked less like fangs and more like jagged, broken shards of obsidian. And rising from its brow were the horns. Two massive, curved horns like those of a gargantuan ram that swept down and then forward, their tips sharpened to wicked points. The horned one, the cave dweller, the alpha predator. It stopped just at the edge of the darkness, its small, black, pitiless eyes fixing on the werewolf. There was a hateful intelligence in that gaze, the cold, calculating look of a creature that had ruled this domain for centuries. There was no posturing, no warning growl. The time for challenges was over. With a snarl that was a mixture of spit and fury, the werewolf, Isaac, dropped to all fours. He dug his claws into the gravel floor, propelling himself forward like a cannonball, a black blur of motion. At the same instant, the horned behemoth lowered its head and charged, its immense feet pounding the ground, shaking the very foundations of the tunnel. The two monsters met in the center of the grotto with a cataclysmic impact that sounded like a car crash. The sheer force of the collision echoed like a thunderclap, a violent, explosive beginning to a battle between gods and demons in the dark heart of the earth. The fight was a maelstrom of brutal, unrestrained violence. The confined space of the tunnel turned the battle into a claustrophobic, deafening spectacle of tooth, claw, and horn. The air filled with the sounds of their combat, the wet tear of flesh, the sharp crack of claw against hide as tough as Kevlar, and the deep, guttural roars of the two behemoths locked in a life-or-death struggle. Isaac was a dervish of black fur and controlled fury. He was impossibly fast, a blur of motion that was hard to track in the dim light. He used his speed and agility as his primary weapons, darting in to slash at the horned creature's thick legs and flanks, then leaping back before the behemoth could retaliate. His claws, which I'd seen sprout from human fingers, left deep bleeding furrows in the creature's mottled hide. But the wounds seemed to enrage it more than harm it. The horned monster was a creature of pure, brute force. It was slower, more ponderous, but every one of its movements carried terrifying weight and power. It didn't try to match Isaac's speed. It simply tried to crush him. It swung its massive head like a battering ram, its horns gouging deep channels in the rock walls of the tunnel wherever they struck. A single direct hit would be enough to end the fight, and both combatants knew it. The beast swiped with its massive forelimbs, each blow landing with the force of a wrecking ball, sending showers of stone and gravel flying through the air. I pulled Miller back, pressing us both flat against the tunnel wall, trying to stay clear of the collateral damage. We were no longer participants. We were spectators to a war as old as time. "We have to do something." Miller yelled over the din, his voice cracking with panic. He was right. Isaac was fast, but he was taking damage. The horned beast had caught him with a glancing blow from its horn, opening a deep gash in his shoulder. He was starting to slow, his movements becoming just a fraction less precise. He couldn't win a war of attrition. My eyes scanned the grotto, my mind racing, looking for any advantage, any weakness. The battle had churned up the tunnel floor, but the walls and ceiling were still solid rock. My flashlight beam danced across the ceiling and caught on something. A section of rock directly above the main combat area that looked different. It was a tangled mess of fractured stone and looser-looking scree, an overhang that looked precarious, almost like a natural deadfall trap. An idea, born of pure desperation, sparked in my mind. "Miller!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pointing my light at the ceiling. "Look, that overhang, if we can bring that down." He followed my beam, his eyes widening as he understood. It was a long shot, a crazy idea, but it was better than cowering against a wall waiting to die. Nearby, a long, thick shard of metal from the train wreck lay half buried in the gravel, probably thrown clear in the derailment. It was a twisted piece of support strut, maybe 10 feet long, heavy but manageable for 2 men. "Grab that end," I ordered. While the 2 monsters were locked together, the werewolf's jaws clamped futilely on the beast's thick neck, and the beast trying to crush him against the wall. We scrambled for the metal strut. It was heavy as hell, but adrenaline is a powerful fuel. We half dragged, half carried it to the wall directly beneath the unstable rock formation. The plan was simple, brutal. We'd used the strut as a lever. There was a wide crack at the base of the rock wall, just under the overhang. If we could wedge the strut in there and put our combined weight on it, we might be able to shift the support rock just enough to trigger a collapse. "On my count," I grunted, shoving one end of the strut deep into the fissure. 1, 2, 3. We threw all of our weight onto the metal bar. It groaned in protest. Dust and small pebbles trickled down from the ceiling, but the main formation held. Below us, the horned beast threw Isaac off with a furious roar and charged again. "Again!" I yelled. We heaved, our muscles screaming, our feet slipping on the loose gravel. The strut bent slightly, the groan of stressed metal lost in the symphony of the monster's battle. More dust fell. A larger crack appeared in the rock above. It was working. The horned beast had Isaac pinned, its massive head pushing the werewolf back, its obsidian teeth snapping just inches from his throat. Isaac's claws scrabbled for purchase on the creature's hide, his strength clearly failing. He was losing. "Now!" I screamed, putting every last ounce of strength I had into one final desperate push. "Push!" Miller screamed with effort beside me. There was a loud, sharp crack from the rock wall above us, a sound like a gunshot. The lever moved. The support gave way. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening groan, the entire rock overhang detached from the ceiling and came crashing down in an avalanche of stone and dust, directly onto the 2 fighting monsters below. The rock fall was a deafening, grinding cataclysm of sound and fury. A thick cloud of choking dust instantly filled the grotto, blotting out my flashlight beam and reducing visibility to 0. The ground shook with the impact of tons of falling stone. For a long, terrifying moment, the only sound was the rain of smaller rocks and debris clattering to the floor. Then, silence. A deep, profound silence that was more unnerving than the chaos it replaced. Miller and I were frozen, pressed against the wall, chests heaving, our ears ringing. "Did it work?" He coughed, his voice raspy from the dust. "I don't know. I breathed, slowly pushing myself upright. I raised my maglite, its beams struggling to pierce the thick, swirling cloud of gray dust. We waited, every muscle tense, listening for any sound, any movement from the burial mound we had created. Nothing. Slowly, agonizingly, the dust began to settle. The air cleared just enough for my beam to find the wreckage. The sight was one of utter devastation. A massive pile of sharp, jagged boulders, some as large as a car engine, lay heaped in the center of the grotto. Sticking out from under the pile was the twisted, motionless hind leg of the horned monster. One of its massive horns, snapped clean off at the base, lay nearby like some grotesque trophy. A thick, black, tar-like fluid, its blood, was pooling on the floor, soaking into the gravel. The ancient ruler of the tunnel was dead. My light then swept to the side of the rock pile, searching for the other combatant. A low, pained groan guided my beam. The werewolf Isaac was pulling himself free. He had been at the edge of the rock fall, escaping the main impact, but he hadn't gotten away unscathed. He was a ruin. His black fur was matted with blood, his own and the creature's. The gash on his shoulder was wide and deep, and a dozen other cuts crisscrossed his body. One of his legs was twisted at a sickening angle, clearly broken. He moved with a painful, dragging limp, his breath coming in wet, ragged pants that spoke of broken ribs. He was alive, but only just. Slowly, painfully, he dragged his broken body clear of the last of the rocks. And then he turned his head and looked at us. The immediate threat of the horned beast was gone. But now we were left with this one. The monster that had won. The monster we had freed. Miller shrank back, a small, terrified sound escaping his lips. My training, my instinct, my entire being screamed at me to act. I raised my .44, the heavy steel cool and steady in my hand. The hammer clicked back with a sound that was unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the grotto. I centered the sight squarely on the werewolf's head. My finger tightened on the trigger. He didn't move. He didn't snarl. He just stood there, swaying on his feet, his massive chest rising and falling with labored effort. He watched me, his glowing yellow eyes holding my gaze. And in those eyes behind the feral fire, I saw it. It wasn't just the dumb rage of a wild animal. It was more. There was pain. There was exhaustion. And there was a clear, unmistakable flicker of the man I'd cuffed just an hour earlier. An intelligence, a memory. He knew who I was. He knew the deal we'd made. And I knew he was waiting to see if I would honor it. The moment stretched, suspended in time. It was just the three of us in that ancient, blood-soaked cave. The terrified survivor, the wounded monster, and me, the lawman standing between them. My arm didn't waver. My aim remained true. But my finger did not pull the trigger. An unspoken understanding passed between me and the beast. A debt had been paid in blood and violence. A bargain had been fulfilled. It was a silent, tense acknowledgement in the heart of the mountain, a moment of silence between two hunters on opposite sides of a war that the world wasn't supposed to know existed. The standoff held for a count of 5. A silent negotiation played out in the space between my gun barrel and his glowing eyes. The tension finally broke, not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate nod. My nod. I lowered the .44. I didn't holster it. That would have been a fool's move. But I let the barrel point toward the ground, a clear gesture of truce. The immediate danger was over. The deal had been kept. "The deal is done, Isaac," I said, my voice low and steady, a strange formality in the gore-splattered cavern. My words were for the man I knew was listening from inside the beast. "You're free. Go. before the sun comes up." The werewolf watched me. Its massive head tilted slightly. Its wet, ragged breathing was the only sound. I took a half step forward, making sure Miller stayed behind me. My duty, my oath as a marshal, demanded I add the final, crucial piece. This wasn't forgiveness. It was a stay of execution. "But know this," I added, my voice hardening again, re-establishing the line between us. "My job isn't finished. This changes nothing between us. I'll be coming for you." For a long moment, the creature just stared, the intelligence in its eyes weighing my promise. Then it gave a low, guttural grunt. A sound that was not quite a growl, not quite a word, but a clear acknowledgement. An understanding. He knew the hunt would resume. Favoring his shattered leg, the massive creature turned. With a painful, dragging limp, he headed not for the entrance we had come from, but deeper into the tunnel system, into the unexplored blackness where the horned beast had made its lair. He glanced back once, a final look from those glowing yellow eyes, and then the shadows swallowed him completely, leaving us alone with the dead. I kept my gun ready for a full minute after he was gone before finally holstering it. I turned to Miller, who was still pressed against the wall, his face pale and smeared with dust, his eyes wide with a terror that would likely never leave him. "Come on, kid," I said, my voice softer now. "Let's get the hell out of here." Epilogue. We emerged from the mouth of the tunnel into the cold, clean air of the pre-dawn Mojave Desert. The storm had passed completely, scrubbing the sky clean. To the east, the horizon was a bruised purple ribbon, heralding the coming dawn. The world seemed deceptively peaceful, the silence a stark contrast to the subterranean horror we had just survived. The wrecked train lay nearby, a twisted metal skeleton in the pale emerging light, a monument to the violence of the storm. Miller leaned against the rock face, breathing deeply, his eyes fixed on the brightening sky as if he couldn't believe it was real. He would have a hell of a story to tell, though I knew he never would. People who told stories like this ended up in padded rooms. I didn't look at the sunrise. My gaze was fixed on the dark, gaping maw of the tunnel, a black wound in the side of the mountain. One monster was dead. Its reign of terror ended under a pile of rock. But the other, my quarry, my responsibility, was now free. Wounded, but free. He had held up his end of the bargain. Now, I had to hold up mine. The hunt wasn't over. Our strange and violent dance across the forgotten corners of the country had not ended here. This was just an intermission. I looked from the dark cave to the vast, empty desert that stretched out before me. 1,000 places for a creature like Isaac to hide. He had a head start, just as I'd promised. But the sun was rising, and soon my hunt would begin again.